All right, so Reformed scholasticism. Again, just some review here. In the Reformation, post-Reformation period, the term scholasticism was put onto some theologians, and it was in some context negative, all right, because it kind of harkened back to medieval scholasticism, which the Reformation was obviously reacting against. But it really had to do with Reformed theology in the late 16th century and 17th century. All right, so that's our period, and it affects Lutheranism, Reform. So it's not just one particular branch of the Reformation that would have a Protestant scholasticism, Reformed Orthodox, for example, Reformed Orthodoxy or the Reformed scholasticism. All right, but what I want to mention here, and I didn't define this yesterday, the scholasticism that we're talking about, it's not a theology, it's a method. Right? So, if, for example, you say, what are the medieval schoolmen? They didn't all teach the same thing. It's a method where in the Protestant scholasticism, all right, Scripture is supreme. All right? So you have a method, a methodology of doing theology where Scripture is supreme, but we do use logic and syllogisms. And confessions of faith, and it used tradition, but it used tradition less than the medieval scholasticism. And it is a thorough systematization of theology. All right, so when we're dealing with this scholasticism, I'm going to keep in mind it is a method. All right, and there are going to be geographical variations, and I mentioned this yesterday. The Dutch, would have a Dutch strand. The English would have an English strand, but because of interaction, there's going to be mutual benefit of both. And I think really, in one sense, John Owen is one of the best pictures of that. Carl Truman, professor of church history at Westminster Theological Seminary, he has a book on John Owen and about really the Catholicity of John Owen, just the broadness of John Owen and his interactions and dealings. And he deals with Owen really as a Reformed Orthodox theologian and how he benefited from others. So really helpful book. And I can't remember who it was. Somebody in this class, maybe Tim, said something about doing their paper on Owen. It's obviously a book to consult because it addresses this stuff. So again, that's a reminder. Choose a paper sometime soon. Have it approved, the topic approved, and then begin working on it. But again, so really any of these guys, or if you wanted to do something on one of the Reformed Orthodox men, whether it's Witsius, Cassius, Voetius, and what were the variations of their covenant theology, because there was intramural debate on these issues. But we want to keep in mind it's a method, right? It's a method of doing theology, a thorough systematization of theology. One thing that has arisen in the last several decades as Reformed Orthodoxy has been studied, and really there's going to be an element here where it's kind of like heresy. What's the silver lining of heresy? That the church responds to it and articulates the truth better, right? More clearly. They have come to a greater, more clear understanding. So within the last several decades, there's been a charge against Calvinists, that Calvin would not be a Calvinist today. All right, so you see these things like Calvin versus the Calvinists, and that the Puritans have a substantial departure from the reformers. And so with that charge, with that accusation, there's been a number of theologians, historians who've done a lot of good work. So we're actually living in a really exciting day for Reformed Orthodox studies. Right? Richard Muller, up there at Calvin Theological Seminary, he's got his 4-volume work on Reformed dogmatics where, he just has culled through, all these Orthodox men and arguing that, no, there is a substantial continuity, right, between the Reformers and the Reformed Orthodox. Paul Helm, out there at Regent, has focused on Calvin. All right, his specialty is Calvin, and has argued very clearly that Calvin is a Calvinist. And so you got all these fascinating things. But so there is a revisionist approach to Reformed scholastic or Protestant scholasticism, that the scholastics departed from what the Reformers taught. For example, Beza, Calvin's successor, he departed from Calvin, all right, over these issues. Well, did he? Or is there theological continuity? All right. Calvin, and from what, 1509 to 1564, he cannot address every theological topic in its fullest detail while he's alive. So there are going to be things that he did not give attention to. But does that mean that the things that were later developed do not exist in a small way in his writings, or the ramifications of his writings would lead you? And so here we're talking about, for example, the Lapsarian debate, the order of God's decrees. Your boy Jacob Arminius, we get Arminianism. All right, he studied at Geneva, right, under Beza, and so he's reacting and objecting to, superlapsarianism. And so, given that historical debate context, it's like, oh, Beza wasn't teaching, what Calvin taught, and all these things. So these are issues that we have to deal with, and there is a revision approach that says, look, all these guys, they just departed. It's a completely new thing, and it's not. There is a consistency. There's a theological development, and I think one's philosophy of historical theology, all right, is going to come in play. And you want to find something that's really there, right? You don't want... Rome has its own philosophy of historical theology, right? In many ways, thanks to the really gifted writing of John Henry Newman, right? That individual, and we'll mention his name later as we look at the Oxford movement, the Tractarian movement, who was an Anglican, and then he converted to Rome, became a cardinal, and really became the one that provides the historical theological argument for why we can have something becoming dogma in 1870. Papal infallibility. All right. So he's going to have his seed form, thing. The difference is they're looking at things that actually were either written against or not there. Right. Just because we can say, look, Calvin didn't address that issue doesn't mean that his successors departed from him. May it just be something that he didn't address the issue? So you have that. So Scripture, confessions, reason. But reason was not ultimate. All right. Because it's another thing as we deal with church history, and we look at movements and reactions, and what you have is a lot a new emphasis on something that is reacting against another thing. So you have the Reformed Orthodox, they're using reason. I mean, you read their stuff and like, whoa, they're really logical. All right. Very consistent there. But then we have something like the Enlightenment, right? That makes reason ultimate. That makes reason the authority. And we don't like that, right? And I hope everyone says we don't like that. So is the solution to be unreasonable? I had a professor once who said, I would believe that doctrine if it said it explicitly in Scripture. Now, I get that logically it is the most consistent, but unless Jesus says this, I'm not going to adhere to, because, and then it's like, see, this is the thing with Reformed people. They're just trying to be logical. What's our alternative? Wow, that theology, that's incredibly illogical. That must mean it's right. No. It's one of, we don't want, as Reformed people, to have logic be ultimate. Right? We want to go where the text goes, but we also want to admit, if this is God's text, there's going to be logic to it, right? And it's going to fit. Now, we may have to come to a place and say, I may not be able to grasp, but I want to let the text dictate my system of theology. But in a sense, that's what the Reformed Orthodox are doing. Here's the Reformers. They're dealing exegetically. They're working through the Scripture. Now, let's systematize this. What does Scripture teach? All right. And the Lutherans are going to say, Scripture teaches this, and here you have our formula of concord. All right. This is what we say Scripture teaches. Someone walks up to me and says, what do you believe the Scriptures to teach? I've got to run, but here's my confession. So our confession, it's a substandard, right? Our Bible's, that's ultimate. But our confession tells us that the Bible's ultimate. That's actually part of our written confession, that we're reminded in it that the Bible's ultimate. But we do believe that the confession is the summary statement of what Scripture teaches. So that's why we submit to it. Not ultimately, we submit to Scripture ultimately. But you understand? So there's not an inconsistency to saying I'm confessional. Like if you say, "Oh, so you don't? The Bible is the sole rule of your..." No, actually, my confession says that. But I want my confession to make sense. I want it to be logical. But again, all I'm saying is, logic is not a bad thing unless you make finite logic ultimate. All right? Reason is not a bad thing unless reason is your God. So we talk to people on the sidewalk at Starbucks, sometimes even at church, and you say, look, again, I thought that the testimonies last night were fascinating. I think sometimes, I told Bridget last night, I think sometimes, in the free church, you think everyone's had the same background. But it's fascinating last night. Right? Someone goes to a Roman Catholic school, graduates an atheist. Another person goes through Rome and is a good Romanist, but then is then converted. You have someone who grows up in a Buddhist home and is converted, and then two people grew up in the free church, and one person grew up and it was described as like a buffet. I mean, it's kind of fascinating, right? But someone says, unless you prove it to me. If I can't see it, then I'm not going to believe it. That's making reason ultimate. Right? That's not good. But when we preach, when we teach, we are appealing to the mind, right? See, so let's not throw everything out. And we're going to see that eventually, as Reformed Orthodoxy goes on, and you see what, I think it's, was it Mueller who called that the deconfessionalization period, where people then get closer to making reason more ultimate. Does that make sense? Like, balance. And let the Bible tell us what and how to balance. Right? Are we good with that? Maybe not everybody? No, we're good. So, scholasticism, a method. All right? Just to give you some names here. In Lutheran Orthodoxy, Martin Chemnitz writes a systematic theology, which is a response to the Council of Trent, involved the formula of concord. So he will stand in opposition to Trent. His examination of the Council of Trent was considered to be one of the most damaging works to the Roman decrees. Right? So if you want a contemporary evaluation of Trent, you'd probably want to consult Chemnitz. Right? Johann Gerhard. All right, so we're in Lutheran. Lutheran scholasticism. We've got Martin, Chemnitz, and then Johann Gerhard. Anybody read Latin in here? All right, if you go in our library, we have a 18th century edition of Johann Gerhard's Loci Communis, or Loci Theologicae. It was Melanchthon who wrote Loci Communis. We've got the whole thing, 18th century edition, but it's in Latin. So, Alan, you can read it to us. Maybe parts of it. Fascinating. If you see the plaque in there, the Ludlam collection. Robert Ludlam was a CRC minister in 20th century. Amassed a vast library, primarily on liberalism, modernism. Fascinating story. He was a CRC minister, and as modernism was coming into his denomination, he thought, in order to combat this, I need to be able to interact with it, right? And so he's like, so I'm going to take a sabbatical, and he got his doctorate at Yale because he wanted to study under one of the leading modernists of his day, He's like, why go to the secondary sources, right? He goes straight. And so got his doctorate, and in fact, his advisor is was the leading Septuagint scholars of the day, who was influential in my dad's. Because my dad did his dissertation on the Septuagint, and so come to find out, they had common interest, and so that was just a neat thing. But anyway, so he donated his library after he died. His family donated his library to us, so that's what we have in there. And so Adam Akery and I went up to Virginia, right, and we get this, bring U-Haul thing, and so we're taking, unloading the box, which is like Christmas, every day you're just opening boxes of books, right, and opening these just huge volumes that look really old. I'm like, oh, what's that? 18th century edition of Gerhard. All right, and I'm like, in really good shape too, and you can look at them in there, but just you're not to check them out, you're not to take them out of the room, and don't manhandle them. All right, so I'm like, I wonder how much those are. Go online, a copy that looks to be in slightly worse condition than us, selling it for $6,000. So there you go. But we have a Lutheran Orthodox edition in there. Johann Gerhard. He represents the height of Lutheran Orthodoxy. So those are just some other names. George Calixtus. All right, if you want to do, would be in Reformation class, a paper on, in a Lutheran controversy. You would want to know his name. Reformed Orthodoxy. Beza. Despite some of the misrepresentations of Beza, contemporaries refer to him as a godly man. But again, because he's dealing with those harsh topics of double predestination, supralapsarianism, those things. I mean, he's gotten a reputation of being the cold, heartless, theologian. It's not the case. I believe he was influential with the theology of Dort. One of my favorites, Zacharias Ursinus. He's written a commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism. Influential, along with Caspar Olivianus, right, of the Heidelberg Catechism. So Ursinus, Olivianus, names that you'd want to know for Heidelberg Catechism. Johannes Cassius, active in Germany, in the Netherlands. This was called the Father of Covenant Theology. Covenant of Works, Covenant of Grace, Federal Headship, taught the continuity between Israel and the church, although that was not a unique point to him, but he later influenced the Puritans and even the Princeton theologians. Another name that's within Reformed Orthodoxy, you're going to be familiar with this in Christology when we look at the work of Christ. What is it? Amyraldianism, the hypothetical universalism. So God wills that all men be saved. Christ's death makes the salvation of all men possible. But it's effective only for the elect. So Raymond has an interesting section on that. Kind of just lists out the Amyraldian order of decrees and kind of highlights the fact that you have decrees that kind of are opposed to each other. And so does God decree things that are opposed to his own decree? And whenever you see his name in this discussion, you're going to see Francis Turretin, Eclectic Theology. I believe we have here in our library. Do we have that? Yeah. Genevan Systematizer of the Reformed Faith. Compiled the Helvetic Consensus, which is considered to be one of the high statements of Reformed Orthodoxy. Argued for absolute inerrancy of Scripture, divine preservation of Scripture. His systematic influence Princeton. Again, this is what Hodge used, and I think does anybody remember the statistic? It said how many people came through Old Princeton. All right, just like thousands of ministers in America came through Old Princeton and would have studied Turretin. All right, because of being in Hodge's classes. All right, John Gill. One of the first significant noted Baptist theologians. You remember the Baptist history? They kind of break between general Baptist and particular Baptist. All right, so the general Baptist, more that universal intent to the atonement. The particular Baptist, particular redemption. He wrote the word body of divinity. I have to check this, but I think it's been said Spurgeon referred to it as a continent of mud. Because Spurgeon wasn't a big fan of the hyper aspect, and Gill's not the easiest guy to read. I mean, you don't want to take away from him. I mean, he was a believer, and he was a gifted theologian. All right, so really the theological issues that are at play here, you're going to have, and you can put John Owen in there too. There's obviously many other names, but I just want to give to you, all right, in the Reformed Orthodoxy, we're dealing with issues of the decrees of God, predestination, the extent of the atonement. Then you have some ongoing debates with people outside of Orthodoxy. For example, Owen with the Socinians. So I mean, these are all things we want to put in their historical context here. All right, and so the Reformed Orthodoxy, this period that goes from the Reformation period really up through, the mid 1700s. All right, that's what we're looking at, and we want to have an appreciation for their theology and for their contribution to the church of this period. And what we'll do next, now we're going to look at a movement that some would say comes out of and then coincides with this, and that's pietism. All right, pietism, where the emphasis will be more on, an experience.